November 13th, a date that has witnessed America confront its own limitations in technology, in diplomacy, and in the face of nature itself. It's a day when military strategy failed, when natural disaster warnings were ignored, and when intelligence systems broke down. What if some of America's most tragic moments weren't just bad luck, but the direct result of preventable errors in judgment? Today, we investigate 4 critical failures that happened on November 13th. Moments when arrogance and oversight led to devastating consequences. History's greatest lessons often come from our most profound failures. The mistakes we'll examine today reveal a common thread: the danger of assuming we have control over complex systems, whether they're military strategies, natural environments, or international relations. In this 20-minute investigation, we'll analyze 4 system failures that occurred on November 13th. We'll examine how military overreach in Vietnam led to catastrophe, how a slow diplomatic response created an international crisis, how disaster preparedness failed completely, and how intelligence agencies missed critical warnings. These are not just stories of what went wrong. They're urgent lessons about the cost of arrogance and inaction. Mistake number 1. Vietnam War. The Battle of Ia Drang becomes a trap, 1965. Our first investigation takes us to the jungles of Vietnam, where America's growing military commitment was about to face its first major test, and where military success would create a strategic trap. The context: escalation and the body count doctrine. To understand America's fateful commitment, we have to go back to the end of World War II. Vietnam was a French colony, and Ho Chi Minh, a communist nationalist, led the fight for independence. The U.S., embroiled in the new Cold War, saw this not as a war of decolonization, but through a single lens, containing the global spread of communism. This was the domino theory in action, the fear that if Vietnam fell to communism, all of Southeast Asia would follow. After the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu in 1954, the Geneva Accords temporarily split Vietnam in two at the 17th parallel, promising nationwide elections in 1956. But the U.S., fearing Ho Chi Minh would win, blocked those elections and instead poured money and advisors into building a separate, anti-communist state in the South under Ngo Dinh Diem. From the start, America was building a nation on a foundation of political illegitimacy. The South Vietnamese government was corrupt and unpopular. A communist insurgency, the Viet Cong, grew stronger with support from the North. President Kennedy significantly increased the number of U.S. military advisors, but the situation deteriorated. After Diem's U.S.-backed assassination in 1963, South Vietnam spiraled into political chaos. The stage was set for a massive American intervention: the military strategy of attrition and the body count doctrine. When Lyndon Johnson took office, he was determined not to be the president who lost Vietnam. A dubious naval incident in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964 gave him the pretext he needed. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving Johnson broad war powers. This was the green light for full-scale war. The U.S. commander, General William Westmoreland, faced a fundamental problem. This was not a conventional war with front lines. The enemy's goal was not to hold territory, but to survive, erode American will, and win the support of the South Vietnamese people. So, how do you measure victory in such a war? Westmoreland's answer was a brutal, quantifiable metric: the body count. The central strategy became search and destroy. The goal was not to capture and hold land, but to seek out the enemy and kill them in such large numbers that they would eventually reach a crossover point, where they were being killed faster than they could be replaced, breaking their will to fight. This doctrine corrupted the entire war effort from the ground up. Tactical focus. The success of a unit and the promotion of its officers became tied to the number of enemy killed. This created a powerful incentive to inflate numbers and to engage in fights that produced high casualties, rather than those that achieved long-term strategic goals. The hearts and minds failure. The very nature of search and destroy was destructive. To find the enemy, U.S. forces would sweep through villages, uprooting civilians, destroying homes and crops. This alienated the very South Vietnamese population the U.S. was supposedly there to save, driving them into the arms of the Viet Cong. A misleading metric: the U.S. was counting bodies, but the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were counting time and political will. They were willing to absorb horrific losses for years, believing correctly that American public opinion would not tolerate a long, bloody war of attrition. The body count doctrine was a catastrophic miscalculation. It mistook a political and revolutionary struggle for a purely military problem. It led to atrocities like the My Lai massacre, where the pressure to produce a high body count overrode basic humanity. And it created a victory narrative in Washington that was completely divorced from the chaotic, brutal reality on the ground. By measuring the wrong thing, America lost sight of the war's true objective and, ultimately, lost the war itself. The November 13th turning point, 1965. By mid-November 1965, General Westmoreland's strategy was to locate and fix the enemy with his new tool, the Airmobile 1st Cavalry Division. Intelligence suggested the Chu Pong Massif, a rugged mountain complex straddling the Cambodian border, was a haven for communist forces. The plan, codenamed Operation Silver Bayonet, was to insert troops by helicopter to find and kill the enemy. On November 13th, a critical decision was made. Aerial reconnaissance selected a small, clearing dubbed landing zone, LZ X-ray, as the primary insertion point. The choice was tactically sound from an airmobile perspective. It was large enough for 8 to 10 helicopters at a time, but it was strategically perilous. It was located in a bowl, right at the base of the mountain, surrounded by dense jungle that provided perfect cover for enemy forces. This is where the critical underestimation began. U.S. intelligence believed they were hunting for scattered Viet Cong battalions. In reality, LZ X-ray was situated at the doorstep of the headquarters and main fighting force of the People's Army of Vietnam, NVA, 66th Regiment, with the battle-hardened 33rd Regiment close by. This was not a guerrilla force. It was a professional, well-equipped main force unit that outnumbered the initial U.S. force by potentially 4 to 1. The U.S. command had no idea they were about to land a single battalion in the heart of an entire NVA division's base area. The decision on November 13th to use LZ X-ray was a calculated risk that ignored the fundamental principles of terrain. They were landing in a bottom-up position, with the enemy holding the commanding high ground. The NVA, from their concealed positions on the slopes, could observe every U.S. movement, count their numbers, and pinpoint their defensive positions as they landed. U.S. commanders also fatally underestimated the NVA's tactical sophistication. They expected a disorganized enemy that would break under superior American firepower. Instead, the NVA commander, General Chu Huiman, had a brilliant multi-layered plan. Let the Americans land. He allowed the 1st U.S. Battalion to land uncontested, letting them commit to the battlefield, isolate and surround. He then used his superior knowledge of the terrain to move his forces through hidden trails and surround LZ X-ray, cutting off escape routes. Hugging tactics. His orders were to get so close to the Americans that they cannot use their artillery. By engaging in close quarters human wave attacks, the NVA sought to neutralize the U.S.'s greatest advantage: overwhelming aerial and artillery support. So, as the sun rose on November 14th, the stage was set not for a successful search and destroy mission, but for an ambush. The decisions of November 13th, the choice of LZ X-ray, the failure of intelligence, the underestimation of the enemy's strength and will, had placed a single U.S. battalion, the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, directly into a meat grinder. The Battle of Ia Drang was not a battle the Americans stumbled into. It was a battle they walked into, based on a series of flawed assumptions that would be paid for in blood over the next 4 days. The consequence: the attrition trap. Analysis of how this successful battle convinced American officials they could win through attrition, leading to massive troop increases and a decade of bloody stalemate. The battle became a blueprint for a failed strategy that would cost 58,000 American lives and fracture American society. Mistake number 2. The Iran hostage crisis, diplomatic inertia, 1979. From a military failure abroad to a diplomatic failure that would bring an international crisis into American living rooms for 444 days. The context: revolution and rising tensions. To understand the explosion of anger in 1979, we have to go back to 1953. Iran's popular, democratically elected Prime Minister, Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalized the country's oil industry, which had been controlled by the British. This move threatened Western economic interests. In response, the American CIA and British MI6 orchestrated a covert coup, codenamed Operation Ajax, to overthrow Mossadegh and solidify the power of the young monarch, Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The US put him back on his throne. From that moment forward, the Shah was seen by millions of Iranians as a puppet of Washington, not a leader of his own people. For the next 25 years, the Shah was America's staunchest ally in the Middle East. He modernized Iran's economy with oil wealth, a period known as the White Revolution. But this modernization was brutally authoritarian. It was enforced by his vicious secret police, SAVAK, trained by the CIA and Israel's Mossad. SAVAK tortured and executed thousands of political opponents, dissidents, communists, and religious conservatives. To the Iranian people, the Shah represented corruption, Western decadence, and violent oppression. The primary voice of opposition was a stern, uncompromising Shia cleric in exile, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. From Iraq and later France, Khomeini railed against the Shah as a corrupt and un-Islamic Taghouti, idol worshipper, and condemned America as the Great Satan. His sermons were smuggled into Iran on cassette tapes, fueling a massive, revolutionary movement that united secular liberals, socialists, and a deeply religious populace. In January 1979, the Shah, sick with cancer and losing control, was forced to flee Iran. 2 weeks later, Khomeini returned to Tehran to a hero's welcome. The revolution was complete. The monarchy was abolished, and Khomeini began establishing a new, theocratic state, the Islamic Republic of Iran. The number one goal of this new regime was to purge all Western influence and avenge the crimes of the old regime. The fateful decision: letting the Shah in. This is where the stage was set for catastrophe. The exiled Shah was now a pariah, bouncing from country to country, desperately seeking a permanent home. The new Iranian government demanded his return to stand trial for his crimes, a certain death sentence. In October 1979, the Shah's health deteriorated rapidly. He had lymphoma and needed urgent medical treatment unavailable in his current host, Mexico. A powerful lobby of American figures, including former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and banker David Rockefeller, pressured President Carter to allow the Shah into the United States for humanitarian reasons. Carter was torn. His Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, and the U.S. Ambassador in Tehran, William Sullivan, warned explicitly that admitting the Shah would provoke an extreme reaction, potentially putting the U.S. Embassy at risk. They argued that America's national interest should come before the fate of a fallen dictator. Despite these dire warnings, on October 22, 1979, President Carter made the fateful decision. He allowed the Shah into the United States for medical treatment, citing humanitarian grounds. For the revolutionary government in Iran, this was the ultimate proof of a conspiracy. They saw it as America, the great Satan, once again sheltering their hated tyrant, potentially to orchestrate another coup like in 1953. 2 weeks later, on November 4, 1979, a group of Iranian students, encouraged by the new regime, stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. Their central demand: the return of the Shah to face justice. What was intended as a short-lived sit-in, with the revolution's internal political struggles, solidified into a 444-day crisis that would define Carter's presidency and create a deep, lasting chasm between the two nations. In essence, the hostage crisis was not a random act. It was the direct outcome of 25 years of U.S. support for a brutal dictator, followed by a single, well-intentioned decision that was seen by the revolutionaries as a declaration of war. The November 13th miscalculation, 1979. By this date, the initial shock had worn off, and it became clear this was not a short-term standoff. This segment analyzes the early diplomatic overtures that failed and the administration's underestimation of the militants' resolve and the new government's support for them. The consequence: America held hostage. The immediate political impact was catastrophic for President Jimmy Carter. The 444-day crisis became a daily television spectacle, a symbol of a presidency and a nation that seemed incapable of decisive action. Carter's approval ratings plummeted. His campaign in 1980 was defined by one question: could he free the hostages and restore American power? When a daring military rescue mission, Operation Eagle Claw, ended in a humiliating failure in the desert with 8 American servicemen dead, it cemented the narrative of impotence. The hostages were finally released on January 20, 1981, but only minutes after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president. This timing was perceived as a final insult, a deliberate act by Iran to ensure Carter's defeat. The crisis didn't just contribute to his loss, it defined the failure of his presidency. But the destruction of one presidency was just the beginning. The crisis created a permanent architecture of hostility between the U.S. and Iran that persists to this day. It locked both nations into a vicious cycle of action and reaction. For Iran, the crisis consolidated the power of the hardline clerical regime. It was a revolutionary tool to eliminate moderate factions and rally the nation against an external enemy. It proved that confronting the Great Satan was a successful political strategy. For the U.S., Iran was branded a rogue state and the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism. This led to a policy of total containment and isolation, crushing sanctions, diplomatic freeze, and covert operations. This cycle has fueled every subsequent flashpoint, from Iran's support for Hezbollah and its involvement in the 1983 Beirut bombing that killed 241 U.S. Marines, to the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, which ironically empowered Iran, to the nuclear standoff and the recent escalations, like the assassination of Qasem Soleimani. The deep, structural mistrust born in those 444 days has made any diplomatic breakthrough, like the 2015 nuclear deal, incredibly fragile and politically toxic in both capitals. Perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. The hostage crisis was the capping stone on a decade of American humiliation. It came after the defeat in Vietnam, economic stagflation, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. For 444 days, the world watched a superpower be held hostage by a revolutionary student militia. This created a profound sense of American powerlessness. The image of blindfolded American diplomats was a symbol that the United States could be defied with impunity. This Vietnam syndrome, a national trauma and reluctance to use military force, was compounded by Iran syndrome, a specific anxiety about entanglements in the Middle East. This sense of impotence did not last forever. In fact, it created a powerful political backlash. Ronald Reagan won the presidency by directly promising to restore American strength and confidence. The entire Reagan era can be seen as a forceful reaction against the perceived weakness of the Carter years. The demand for assertive, even aggressive, foreign policy to ensure America would never again be so humiliated became a central tenet of modern American politics. In a very real way, the trauma of the hostage crisis helped forge the resurgent, interventionist American foreign policy of the 1980s and beyond. So, the legacy of November 1979 is not confined to the history books. It is alive in the frozen relations between Washington and Tehran, in the political DNA of both nations' foreign policies, and in the enduring American obsession with never appearing weak on the world stage. Mistake number 3. The Armero Tragedy, a preventable disaster, 1985. From the failures of human conflict to a failure in the face of natural forces, where science provided a warning, but bureaucracy and inertia led to one of the deadliest volcanic disasters in history. The context: warnings ignored. For months, seismologists and geologists had warned that the volcano was building toward a major eruption. A hazard map specifically predicted that a large eruption would melt the glacier, causing lethal mudflows, lahars, that would bury the town of Armero. The November 13th catastrophe, 1985. On the evening of November 13th, 1985, Nevado del Ruiz erupted. The eruption itself was not massive, but it instantly melted glaciers, sending a wall of mud, rock, and debris crashing down the mountainsides. The lahar hit Armero shortly before midnight, burying the town and killing over 20,000 of its 29,000 inhabitants. The mistake: this was a failure of disaster preparedness and communication. Officials had received the hazard maps and warnings but failed to create an effective evacuation plan or adequately warn the population. On the day of the eruption, officials told residents to stay home, a decision that proved fatal. The consequence: a global lesson in risk management. The Armero tragedy became a case study in failed disaster response. It triggered a major overhaul of volcanic hazard monitoring and public communication protocols worldwide, including in the United States. It stands as a stark, haunting lesson that a natural disaster becomes a catastrophe when human systems of preparedness and warning fail. Mistake number 4. The Paris attacks, intelligence failure, 2015. Our final investigation brings us to the heart of modern security failure. When the systems designed to connect dots and prevent tragedy were overwhelmed by complexity and complacency. The context: the age of global terrorism. By 2015, the global counterterrorism landscape had been radically reshaped. The dominant, overwhelming threat was no longer a centralized, secretive network like Al-Qaeda. It was the so-called Islamic State, or ISIS, a proto-state, running a brutal regime across parts of Syria and Iraq, with a declared capital in Raqqa. Unlike its predecessors, ISIS was not hiding. It was conquering territory, generating billions in revenue from oil and extortion, and, most alarmingly, it had mastered a weapon no terrorist group had wielded so effectively: social media propaganda. They weren't just recruiting fighters, they were radicalizing a global audience and explicitly calling for attacks in the West. The threat was a terrifying hybrid. On one hand, ISIS had a sophisticated external operations apparatus, known as the EMNI, which was actively planning complex, coordinated attacks from its heartland. On the other hand, it was inspiring and enabling lone wolf attackers, individuals with no direct training who could launch simple, devastating attacks with a knife, a car, or a gun. For intelligence agencies, this created a needle in a haystack problem of unimaginable scale. The haystack was the entire internet. The needles were hidden among millions of online interactions. The known threats and intelligence systems. In the face of this threat, the West's intelligence alliance, primarily the Five Eyes, US, UK, Canada, Australia, NZ, and key European partners like France, was sharing more information than ever before. The systems were in place. Signals intelligence, SIGINT, the NSA and its partners were vacuuming up vast quantities of digital communications. Human intelligence, HUMINT. Agencies were desperately trying to recruit sources within ISIS's ranks. Financial tracking, they followed the money flows. Databases, systems like the US Terrorist Identities Datamart environment, TIDE, held millions of names. But the system was overwhelmed and fragmented. The fundamental problem was volume and connectivity. There was too much data. Analysts were drowning in a flood of threats, making it nearly impossible to distinguish imminent plots from general aspirational chatter. Furthermore, while international sharing happened at a high level, it was often slow, bureaucratic, and hampered by legacy rivalries and privacy laws. A critical piece of information known to Belgian police about a radicalized individual might not be quickly linked to a separate piece of information held by French intelligence, or it might get stuck in a diplomatic channel. Compounding this was Europe's Schengen Agreement, which allowed for passport-free travel across much of the continent. For terrorists, this was a superhighway. An attacker could be radicalized in Brussels, plan in Paris, and hide in Germany, all without ever passing through an official border checkpoint. National intelligence agencies, structured to protect their own territories, were struggling to operate effectively in this borderless environment. The system was designed for a world of nation-states, but it was fighting a networked, stateless enemy. In essence, by November 2015, intelligence agencies knew a major attack from ISIS was not just likely, but almost inevitable. They were swimming in a sea of threats, but the very systems designed to protect the West, burdened by bureaucracy, volume, and outdated structures, were failing to connect the dots that were right in front of them. The landscape was a perfect storm of a sophisticated enemy, an overwhelmed defense, and fundamental structural vulnerabilities. The November 13th attacks, 2015. This segment focuses on the specific intelligence failures. The attackers were known to various European intelligence services, but the information was not pieced together into a coherent, actionable picture. Systemic overload and poor communication between agencies allowed the plot to proceed undetected. The consequence: the security paradox. Analysis of how this event revealed the fundamental limitations of modern intelligence and surveillance. It led to a massive expansion of security powers and surveillance states in Europe and the US, raising enduring questions about the balance between security and civil liberties in an open society. Conclusion: the pattern of unheeded warnings. When we look at these four events together, a military quagmire, a diplomatic crisis, a natural disaster, and a terrorist attack, a clear and disturbing pattern emerges. In every case, the warnings were there. Military strategists underestimated their enemy. Diplomats misread a revolution. Scientists predicted a catastrophe, and intelligence agencies had pieces of a deadly plot. The common thread is a failure of imagination and a failure of proactive response. It's the tendency of complex systems, governments, militaries, bureaucracies, to operate on autopilot, to downplay risks, and to hope that a looming crisis will simply resolve itself. November 13th teaches us that the most expensive mistake is to ignore the clear evidence in front of us. Whether it's on a battlefield, in a diplomatic cable, in a scientific report, or in an intelligence briefing. The true test of any system is not how it functions on a good day, but how it responds to the first faint signals of failure. Which of these unheeded warnings do you find most tragic? What signals are we ignoring today? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you believe in learning from these critical failures, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching.